For years I thought something was wrong with me, thought my body had failed me, thought I was the reason my husband and I couldn't have children. He held me when I cried, reassured me that we would get through it together, promised me that he would always stand by my side. But it was all a lie. My husband had secretly gotten a vasectomy behind my back, then gaslit me into believing that I was the problem. He laughed when I broke down over negative pregnancy tests, acted like he was so supportive, all while knowing the truth. But the joke was on him, because when I showed him the positive pregnancy test, he was the one who fell apart. Hi, my name is Anna, and for the last 3 years I have believed that I was infertile, believed that something inside me was broken, believed that no matter how much I wanted to be a mother, my body would never let it happen. I had spent countless nights sitting on the bathroom floor, staring at negative pregnancy tests, feeling my heart break over and over again, convincing myself that maybe next month would be different, that maybe one day I would finally see the 2 pink lines I had been hoping for. And through all of it, my husband Mark had been so supportive, always there to hold me, always whispering that he loved me, always pretending to be the perfect, understanding partner. The doctors had run test after test, searching for answers, trying to find the reason why I wasn't conceiving. But every single time the results came back the same. There was nothing wrong with me. I was perfectly healthy, my body was functioning exactly as it should, and there was no medical reason why I wasn't getting pregnant. I remember looking at Mark with tears in my eyes, telling him that maybe he should get checked, maybe he should see a doctor, maybe the problem wasn't me after all. But he just shook his head, gave me a sad smile, and told me that science wasn't perfect, that sometimes things just happen, that maybe we should start considering other options. And because I loved him, because I trusted him, because I thought he wanted a child just as much as I did, I never questioned it. Not until the day I found out the truth. It happened by accident, a discovery I was never meant to make, a secret he had hidden so well that I never even suspected it. I had been cleaning out the bathroom cabinets, tossing out old medications and half-empty bottles of cold medicine, when I found a small envelope tucked behind a stack of towels. I almost ignored it, almost left it there without a second thought. But something about the way it was hidden made my stomach twist, made my fingers hesitate before pulling it out, made my heart start pounding before I even opened it. And when I did, my entire world shattered. Because inside that envelope was a medical receipt, dated over 3 years ago, confirming that my husband had gotten a vasectomy. I stood there, frozen, my fingers gripping the paper so tightly that it crumpled in my hands, my eyes locked onto the date, my mind racing, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. 3 years ago. He had done this 3 years ago. Right before we started trying. Right before he sat beside me in doctors' offices, holding my hand, nodding solemnly when specialists told me they couldn't find anything wrong with me. Right before he let me cry, let me grieve, let me hate myself for something that was never even real. A cold wave of nausea rolled over me, my stomach twisting violently as I stumbled back against the bathroom counter, my entire body shaking with the sheer force of my anger. He had known. All this time he had known. He had sat there, watched me break down, watched me blame myself, watched me question my own worth as a woman, and he had never said a word. He had let me believe it, let me suffer, let me drown in guilt while he played the part of the supportive, devastated husband. I felt like I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process the weight of what I had just uncovered. My hands trembled as I clutched the receipt, my mind replaying every single conversation we had ever had about trying for a baby, every moment when he had lied straight to my face. I thought back to all the times he had comforted me, all the times he had said we would figure it out, all the times he had told me that no matter what, we would never give up. And all along it had been him. He had taken away my choice. He had stolen years from me. My legs felt weak as I pushed away from the sink, as I staggered out of the bathroom, as I clutched that small, crumpled piece of paper like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. My vision blurred with hot, angry tears, my pulse roaring in my ears, my entire body trembling with rage. I had to see him. Had to hear him say it. Had to look him in the eyes and ask him the one question that was screaming inside my head. How long were you going to let me think I was broken? I stormed through the house, my heart slamming against my ribs, my breaths coming in short, ragged gasps as I searched for him. And then just as I stepped into the living room, I saw him, sitting on the couch, his feet propped up, his phone in his hands, looking so relaxed while my entire world had just collapsed. His eyes flicked up when he heard me enter, a small, easy smile pulling at his lips. "Hey babe," he said, completely unaware that everything had just changed. "What's up?" I didn't speak, didn't move, didn't blink. I just held up the receipt. And the second his eyes landed on it, the color drained from his face. I watched it happen in real time. His posture stiffening, his fingers tightening around his phone, his breathing hitching for just a fraction of a second. And in that moment I knew. I knew before he even opened his mouth. I knew before he even tried to deny it. He had lied to me for 3 years. Now I was going to make sure he never got away with it. I stood there gripping the receipt so tightly that my knuckles turned white, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my pulse roaring in my ears as the weight of the betrayal settled deep into my bones. The date on the paper burned into my vision 3 years ago, the number hammering into my skull over and over again, louder than any words I could have spoken, louder than any lie Mark could have told to cover it up. He had done this 3 years ago, made this decision without telling me, taken away my future without a second thought, and then spent every single day since then pretending to grieve with me, pretending to be heartbroken, pretending to love me while watching me fall apart over something he had caused. My stomach twisted violently, nausea crawling up my throat, the sheer audacity of what he had done making my entire body tremble with an anger so sharp it almost scared me. I didn't even realize I was moving until I found myself in the living room, my steps quick, forceful, fueled by pure adrenaline, my fingers gripping the paper like it was the only thing holding me together. My voice came out before I could even think, breaking under the sheer force of my fury as I called out his name. "Mark," I said, and even I could hear how different my voice sounded, cold, sharp, dangerous. He walked in from the kitchen, completely oblivious, a casual smile tugging at his lips as if nothing had changed, as if our entire marriage hadn't just shattered around him. But the second his eyes landed on my face, the second he saw the way my hands shook, the second he noticed the piece of paper clutched between my fingers, his smile faltered. His body went rigid, his casual confidence flickering for just a moment, his expression shifting into something careful, something controlled, something that told me exactly what I needed to know. He already knew what I had found. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice calm, smooth, so perfectly calculated that I almost laughed, almost let the sound of pure disbelief escape my throat. He was trying to play it off, trying to pretend he had no idea what this was about, trying to see just how much I knew before he started scrambling for excuses. But I wasn't going to give him that chance, wasn't going to let him gaslight his way out of this, wasn't going to let him twist the truth into something that made him look like the victim. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, my hands tightening around the paper, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard it felt like it might break. "How long were you going to let me think I was infertile?" I demanded, my voice shaking, my entire body trembling with the sheer force of my rage, my breath uneven as I forced the words out. I held up the paper, watching as his eyes flickered down to it, watching as the color drained from his face, watching as his mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He didn't even try to lie, didn't even try to act like he didn't know what I was talking about, didn't even have the nerve to pretend this was some kind of misunderstanding. Because there was no excuse, no justification, no way to spin this into anything other than what it was. A betrayal beyond anything I could have imagined. His lips parted like he wanted to speak, like he was searching for some explanation, some excuse, some pathetic way to make this seem not as bad as it was, but I didn't give him the chance. 3 years, Mark, I spat, the words seething with fury, my hands shaking as I pointed to the date on the paper. "You had a vasectomy 3 years ago, right before we started trying for a baby? Right before you let me break down, let me blame myself, let me spend night after night sobbing because I thought something was wrong with me?" I could feel the raw emotion clawing its way up my throat, feel the years of grief and frustration morphing into something sharper, something heavier, something I couldn't contain anymore. "You let me suffer. You let me believe that I was broken, that I was the reason we weren't having a baby. And for what? Why, Mark? Why would you do this to me?" Mark took a slow breath, running a hand through his hair, his eyes darting to the paper again before looking back at me, his expression still carefully blank, still trying to figure out what version of the truth would be the safest for him. He started, but his voice cracked, his throat working as he swallowed hard as he tried to force out words he knew wouldn't be enough. "Anna, I can explain." I let out a sharp, bitter laugh, shaking my head as a new wave of anger rolled through me, making my entire body tense, making my hands tremble with the urge to throw the paper straight at his face. "Explain," I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief, with fury, with the raw ache of realizing that the man I had loved had never truly been on my side. "You want to explain why you have been lying to me for 3 years? You want to explain why you sat there watching me fall apart every single month, knowing it was your fault?" I took another step closer, my breath uneven, my vision blurry with rage. "You ruined me, Mark. You let me hate myself while you sat there and comforted me like you weren't the one person who could have stopped it all." His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw tightening, his breathing shallow, and for the first time since this conversation started, I saw something flicker across his face, something close to guilt. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't even close to enough. I shook my head, my grip tightening on the receipt, my voice low and deadly now, the rage settling into something colder, something dangerous. "Tell me the truth, Mark," I said, my tone cutting through the air like a knife. "Did you ever plan on telling me?" He exhaled slowly, his hands still clenched, his entire body rigid, and then, so softly, so quietly, so pathetically, he whispered, "No." The world seemed to stop, the air around me turning thick, my ears ringing with the weight of that single word, my entire body locking into place as the reality of it sank deep into my bones. No. He had never planned on telling me. Never planned on coming clean. Never planned on giving me a choice. And in that moment, standing there in the wreckage of the life I had built with a man who had stolen my future from me, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just the end of my trust in him. This was the end of us. Mark opened his mouth, then closed it again, his jaw tightening, his fingers twitching slightly at his sides, his entire body going rigid like he was desperately trying to calculate the right response. And then, after a beat of thick, suffocating silence, he let out a short, nervous laugh, the kind that told me he was already trying to manipulate the situation, already scrambling to find a way out of the mess he had created, already searching for the right words that would somehow make this my fault instead of his. "Anna, I can explain," he started, his voice careful, his expression shifting into something almost rehearsed, something too controlled, something that told me he had prepared for this moment long before it had ever arrived. But I wasn't interested in explanations, wasn't interested in whatever carefully crafted excuse he had come up with to justify 3 years of gaslighting, 3 years of lying, 3 years of watching me suffer while knowing it was all his fault. "Explain," I snapped, my voice rising, my hands shaking as I held up the receipt, as I forced him to look at it, as I made him face what he had done. "You lied to me, Mark. You let me think something was wrong with me, let me believe that I was broken, let me cry myself to sleep every single night thinking that I was the reason we couldn't have a baby, when all this time, you were the reason I wasn't getting pregnant." He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face, his frustration slipping through for just a second before he quickly masked it with something softer, something practiced, something fake. I wasn't ready," he admitted, his voice low, his shoulders slumping slightly as if that was supposed to make it better, as if that erased the years of pain he had caused, as if his fear justified my suffering. "I thought if I told you the truth you would leave. And I didn't want to lose you, Anna. I was just trying to protect our marriage." I let out a sharp, humorless laugh, a sound so bitter and hollow that even I didn't recognize it, shaking my head in pure disbelief, feeling something inside me crack wide open, something that had been held together for too long by nothing more than blind trust. "Protect our marriage?" I repeated, my voice shaking with rage, my hands clenching at my sides, my entire body vibrating with the sheer force of what I was feeling. "You destroyed our marriage the second you decided to take away my choice. You let me suffer, let me hate myself, let me grieve something that was never even real." I stepped closer, my breath uneven, my vision blurring with white-hot fury, my voice dropping into something dangerously quiet. "You didn't protect anything, Mark. You ruined everything." He stared at me, his mouth opening slightly like he wanted to argue, like he wanted to convince me that I was overreacting, like he wanted to gaslight me the way he had done so effortlessly for years. I could see it in his eyes, the desperate search for an angle, the calculation running behind his expression, the frantic attempt to find any version of this where he wasn't the bad guy, where he wasn't the one at fault, where he could still make me doubt myself. But then, before he could say another word, before he could pull me back into his web of lies, before he could find a way to manipulate me into staying, I dropped the second bombshell that would destroy him completely. Without breaking eye contact, without so much as a flicker of hesitation, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the one thing that would shatter every single illusion he had built, the one thing that would strip away every last bit of control he had left. I held up the small plastic pregnancy test, the 2 pink lines staring back at us like a judgment, like a reckoning, like the final undeniable proof that his plan had failed. And for the first time since I had met him, I watched Mark fall apart. His reaction was instant, his entire body going stiff, his eyes widening in sheer disbelief, his face draining of all color as he took a single shaky step backward. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible, his breathing suddenly uneven, his hands clenching at his sides as if he was trying to hold on to something, as if the ground beneath him had just cracked wide open. That's not possible." I tilted my head slightly, letting him see the absolute certainty in my expression, letting him feel just how much power had shifted between us in that single moment. "Oh, it's very possible," I said, my voice steady, my grip tightening around the test, my entire body pulsing with something that felt like victory. "Because unlike you, Mark, I never lied." His mouth opened like he wanted to argue, like he wanted to deny it, like he wanted to find some way to make this not real. But there was no denying it. No twisting it. No rewriting the truth. Because the evidence was right in front of him, clear and undeniable and absolute. I was pregnant. And for the first time in our entire marriage, Mark was the one who didn't have a choice. Mark's entire body stiffened, his chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven breaths, his hands trembling slightly before he quickly shoved them into his pockets, as if trying to physically conceal his panic. His face had gone ghostly pale, his lips parted slightly as though he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words, as though his mind was running in 1,000 directions, desperately trying to grasp onto some kind of logical explanation for something he had already decided was impossible. I could see it in his eyes, the frantic calculations, the sheer terror as he realized that the plan he had so carefully crafted, the years of manipulation he had built so effortlessly, had suddenly collapsed in an instant. This doesn't make sense, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, his fingers tightening into fists at his sides as he turned away from me, pacing in short frantic steps like a man trying to escape his own reality. His head shook violently, his breaths coming faster, his movements sharp and agitated, his mind clearly scrambling to find a way out. I had a vasectomy, he said again, his voice breaking slightly, his throat working as he swallowed hard, as if saying it out loud would somehow undo the reality in front of him. This can't be happening. His laugh was short and hollow, a sound so unnatural that it sent a chill down my spine, the kind of nervous, empty laugh someone lets out when they realize they've lost everything. I stayed where I was, watching as he continued to pace, watching as he ran a hand through his hair, his fingers tightening at the roots like he wanted to rip the stress from his skull, like he was desperate to turn back time, like he was trying to convince himself that maybe if he just denied it hard enough, it wouldn't be real. Are you sure? He blurted suddenly, his eyes wild as he finally turned back to face me, as if I was the one who had to prove something to him. Maybe the test is wrong? Maybe there was a mistake. I let out a slow, deliberate exhale, my heartbeat steady, my expression unreadable, my voice firm as I held the test up higher, making sure he saw it clearly, making sure there was no room for denial. I took 3, Mark, I said, my words precise, measured, sharp enough to cut. 3 different tests. All positive. His face contorted in something close to pure horror, his jaw tightening, his hands clenching and unclenching as he took another unsteady step back. But how? His voice cracked on the last word, his breathing uneven, his entire body practically vibrating with tension as he shook his head again, his mind still fighting the truth. I tilted my head slightly, letting a small, humorless smirk pull at my lips, watching the way his panic only deepened, watching as he was suddenly the one drowning in uncertainty, the one grasping for explanations, the one who had lost complete and total control. You know what the best part is, Mark? I said, my voice eerily calm, my grip tightening around the test. Vasectomies aren't always permanent. That did it. His entire body went still, his breath hitching, his pupils dilating slightly as the weight of what I had just said sank in. His hands twitched at his sides like he wanted to grab onto something, anything, like he was trying to ground himself in a reality that was no longer his to control. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, his voice weaker now, almost breathless, almost pleading. You're lying. I let out a small, sharp laugh, shaking my head, my eyes never leaving his. Oh no, Mark. You were the liar. You were the one who made decisions for both of us, you were the one who played God with my body, you were the one who spent years watching me fall apart while knowing exactly why I wasn't getting pregnant. I took a step forward, closing the space between us, watching as his body flinched, as he looked trapped, as his carefully built facade finally cracked wide open. And now? I said, my voice dropping lower, my eyes locking onto his. Now you get to live with the consequences. He exhaled shakily, his hands rubbing over his face before dragging down his jaw, his shoulders rising and falling with every uneven breath. He had no plan for this, no script, no carefully curated response that would fix what had just happened. For years he had controlled this narrative, had shaped every conversation to his advantage, had dictated the course of our future without my knowledge or consent. But now, standing here watching the color drain from his face, watching him struggle for words, watching him fall apart, for the first time he had no control at all. And I had never seen anything more satisfying in my entire life. I watched as Mark sank down onto the couch, his hands gripping his hair, his breathing ragged, his entire body trembling with the weight of what he had just learned, his carefully built world crumbling around him. His shoulders rose and fell with every uneven breath, his fingers clutching at his scalp like he was trying to physically hold himself together, like he was desperate to stop the spiral before it consumed him completely. But there was no stopping it now, no rewriting the story, no twisting the facts into something that worked in his favor, no escaping the truth that had finally come crashing down on him. I had spent years feeling exactly like this, lost, helpless, devastated, convinced that I was the problem, convinced that my dreams of motherhood would never come true. And now, for the first time, he was the one drowning in that feeling, he was the one facing a truth he couldn't handle, he was the one falling apart under the weight of his own consequences. Why, Mark? I finally asked, my voice quieter now, not out of sympathy, not out of regret, but out of exhaustion, out of the sheer emotional toll this had taken on me. The anger was still there, still burning beneath the surface, still waiting to rise again, but in this moment, all I felt was drained, like the years of betrayal had finally settled into my bones, like my body had finally registered the truth of what had been done to me. Why would you do this to me? My voice wavered slightly, but I forced myself to keep going, to make him hear me, to force him to acknowledge what he had done. Why would you lie, let me suffer, let me hate myself, all while knowing it was you who made sure I would never get pregnant? I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the pregnancy test, my heart beat loud in my ears as I took a shaky breath. Did you ever stop to think about what that was doing to me? Mark let out a long, shaky breath, his eyes squeezing shut, his head dropping into his hands as if he still couldn't believe this was happening, as if his own actions weren't entirely the reason we were here, as if he still thought there was some version of this where he could make himself look less like the monster he had become. I didn't. He started, his voice barely above a whisper, his words slow, careful, afraid. He swallowed, dragging a hand down his face before finally forcing himself to look at me, his expression shattered, his eyes filled with something that almost looked like regret. But I didn't believe it, not anymore. I didn't want kids, he admitted, his voice strained, each word like a knife straight through my chest. I thought I did, I really did, but then, I got scared. I panicked. He shook his head, his fingers digging into his knees as his body hunched forward, like the weight of the truth was physically crushing him. And I thought if I told you the truth you'd leave. A cold, bitter laugh slipped past my lips before I could stop it, the sound hollow, sharp, filled with something far too broken to be called amusement. I took a slow step back, my legs feeling shaky, my stomach twisting with the full force of his confession. So instead of being honest with me, instead of talking to me, instead of giving me the choice to decide what I wanted for my own life, you stole it from me? My voice cracked slightly, but I didn't care, didn't try to hide the pain in my words, didn't try to soften the blow the way I had done so many times before. I shook my head slowly, my fingers pressing against my temple as I tried to breathe, as I tried to process the sheer magnitude of what he had just admitted to me. You didn't just lie, Mark, I said, my voice shaking, my breath coming out in sharp, uneven bursts as I fought to keep my emotions in check, as I fought against the wave of anger threatening to consume me. You robbed me of something I will never get back. You let me believe I was broken. You let me question everything about myself, let me live with the guilt, let me grieve something that was never even real. My chest rose and fell with the force of my breathing, my pulse hammering in my ears, my body trembling with the sheer rage still building inside of me. And the worst part? He had never even planned on telling me. I took another step back, widening the distance between us, my grip tightening around the pregnancy test, my mind screaming at me to run, to get as far away from him as possible, to never look back. And the worst part? I whispered, my voice barely audible, my throat raw, my body shaking. You never even gave me a choice. Mark's face twisted into something ugly then. Regret, shame, panic, something between desperation and self-preservation, something that told me that for the first time he truly understood what he had done, what he had lost, what was slipping through his fingers. His mouth opened slightly, like he wanted to say something, like he needed to say something, like he finally wanted to fight for the marriage he had spent years poisoning. But the difference now? I was already gone. Mark didn't sleep that night, didn't even try to pretend that everything was fine, didn't bother putting on the calm, composed mask he had worn so effortlessly for years. He paced the living room in frantic, uneven strides, his fingers digging into his hair, his breaths shallow and uneven, muttering to himself like he was trying to fix this, like there was still anything left to fix, like he could somehow rewind time and undo what had already been done. Every so often he would pause and glance toward the bedroom, his face tight with frustration, his eyes flickering with something close to desperation, as if he was waiting for me to come out, as if he was hoping I would change my mind, as if he still believed there was a version of this where I would forgive him. But I didn't come out. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything crash over me, feeling the years of lies settle like a suffocating pressure on my chest, feeling the sharp, bitter realization that no matter what happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. My body was exhausted, my heart was heavy, my mind was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this man as possible, to finally take back the control that had been stolen from me. And in that moment, as I listened to the sound of his restless pacing, as I felt the quiet rage bubbling beneath my skin, as I placed a protective hand over my stomach, I knew exactly what I had to do. The next morning, I made my decision without hesitation, without doubt, without a single shred of uncertainty left in my heart. I packed a bag, grabbed my car keys, and stood at the door with my hand on my stomach, knowing that I wasn't just walking away from me, I was walking away from my child, for the life growing inside me, for the future I refused to let Mark have any control over. I would not let my baby be raised by a man who had stolen my choices, by someone who had played God with my future, by someone who had watched me suffer without an ounce of remorse. I refused to let him take one more thing from me. When he saw me standing there, his eyes widened, his body tensed, and for the first time since this entire nightmare had begun, I saw it: true fear. Not the panic he had felt when I first told him I was pregnant, not the desperate scrambling for control when he realized his plan had failed, not the hollow shock of a man caught in his own web of lies. No, this was something different, something deeper, something real. He knew what was happening. He knew this wasn't just another argument, knew this wasn't something that could be smoothed over with pretty words and shallow apologies, knew this wasn't a moment where he could talk his way back into my heart. "Anna, please," he said, his voice breaking, his breath catching in his throat as he took a hesitant step forward, his hands lifting as if he was afraid I would disappear the second he moved too fast. "We can work through this. I love you." But love wasn't enough. Not anymore. I let out a slow breath, my fingers tightening around the strap of my bag, my heartbeat steady, my voice calm in a way that made his entire body stiffen. "You took away my choices, Mark," I said, my tone unwavering, my eyes locked onto his with a quiet finality that left no room for argument. "So I'm making one now." I turned the doorknob, letting the air from the outside world spill into the room, letting the weight of this moment sink in, letting the truth settle between us like a thick, immovable barrier. "And this time," I continued, my voice dropping just slightly, my words slow, deliberate, powerful, "you don't get a say." And with that, I walked out, leaving behind the man who had spent years making decisions for me, leaving behind the life that had been built on lies, leaving behind the version of myself that had ever believed he was someone worth loving. Because now I was finally free. I didn't look back as I walked out the door, didn't pause to listen to the sound of Mark's voice breaking behind me, didn't let myself hesitate even for a second. His pleas, his desperation, his regret. All of it came too late, all of it meant nothing now, all of it was just noise from a man who had spent years making decisions for me, shaping my future without my consent, lying to my face while pretending to love me. I had spent too much time putting his feelings above my own, had spent too many nights comforting him when I was the one who had been hurting, had spent years believing in a marriage that had been built on lies. But now, for the first time in a long time, I was finally choosing me. The first few weeks without him were harder than I expected, not because I missed him, not because I doubted my decision, but because I had to unlearn the years of manipulation, had to remind myself that I didn't owe him an explanation, had to fight against the deeply ingrained instinct to put his emotions before my own. I stayed with my sister, who welcomed me with open arms and a protective fierceness I hadn't realized how much I needed, who didn't ask too many questions, who simply let me exist without judgment. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my hand resting on my stomach, feeling the slow, steady rise and fall of my own breath, reminding myself that I wasn't alone, that this wasn't just my fight anymore, that I was walking away from my child, for the life growing inside me, for the future I refused to let Mark have any control over. At first, I kept expecting Mark to show up, to knock on the door with apologies and promises, to tell me he had made a mistake, to beg me to come back, to swear he would change, to insist that we could still fix this. But he didn't. Instead, he flooded my phone with messages. Some desperate, some angry, some laced with guilt and manipulation, all of them designed to pull me back, all of them carefully crafted to make me doubt myself. "You're overreacting. We can fix this. I only did it because I was scared. I didn't want to lose you. We're supposed to be a family. Do you really want to raise a child alone?" But none of it mattered anymore. None of his words carried the weight they once had, none of his desperate attempts to make me feel responsible for his actions could undo what had been done. Because no excuse, no justification, no carefully constructed explanation could erase the years of suffering he had put me through, could undo the years of self-doubt he had forced me to live with, could bring back the person I had been before him. Every time I felt the temptation to reply, to hear him out, to give him one last chance, I reminded myself of one simple, undeniable truth. He had taken away my choice and now I was taking it back. It didn't take long for the people in our lives to start asking questions, to notice that I was no longer wearing my wedding ring, to realize that something between Mark and me had changed in a way that couldn't be ignored. Friends and family reached out cautiously, their voices careful, their words hesitant, their curiosity barely hidden behind polite concern. At first, I ignored the messages, avoided the conversations, pretended that I didn't see the looks of confusion whenever someone noticed I was alone. I kept quiet not because I wanted to protect Mark, not because I cared about shielding him from the consequences of his own actions, but because I didn't want to waste another second of my life explaining what he had done, didn't want to drain myself repeating the story of his betrayal to people who might not even believe me. But then the rumors started, the whispers spread like wildfire, twisting the truth before I had even spoken a word. People began saying that I had walked away from a good marriage, that I had abandoned Mark for no reason, that I had thrown away our vows while he had been nothing but a loving, devoted husband. His friends, the ones who had always looked up to him, the ones who had believed he was the perfect man, the perfect partner, the perfect provider, rushed to defend him, painting me as the villain in a story they didn't even know. And for a while I let them talk, let them speculate, let them weave whatever false narrative made them feel better about the man they had put on a pedestal. But then when I heard the first real accusation, that maybe I had been unfaithful, that maybe I had been the one hiding secrets, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. So I sat down with my closest friends and family, the people who had stood by me long before Mark had ever entered my life, the people who deserved to know the truth, and I told them everything. I told them how Mark had lied to me for 3 years, how he had let me believe I was infertile while knowing all along that he was the reason we couldn't conceive. I told them how I had spent years blaming myself, years grieving for something that had never even been real, years suffering while he sat beside me pretending to be heartbroken, pretending to be supportive, pretending to be the perfect husband while knowing full well that he was the one who had stolen my future. I told them how I had discovered the truth by accident, how he had never planned to tell me, how his only regret wasn't what he had done, but the fact that he had been caught. And then when the shock settled in, when the looks of disbelief turned to horror, when the silence stretched between us like a thick, suffocating fog, I pulled out the medical receipt. I let them see the proof with their own eyes, let them hold in their hands the undeniable evidence of his deception, let them read the cold, sterile words that confirmed what I had spent years unknowingly suffering under. And their reactions? Exactly what I had expected. Disgust. Bigger. A collective sense of betrayal, as if they too had been tricked, as if Mark's lies had reached beyond just me, tainting the very foundation of what they had once believed about him. People who had once defended him, people who had once sworn that he was a good man, people who had once thought I was the one who had given up too easily, they saw him now. They saw him for what he truly was. A coward. A liar. A man who had chosen control over honesty, selfishness over love, power over partnership. Words spread quickly, faster than I had anticipated, reaching people I hadn't even spoken to directly. And soon enough, Mark's world started to crumble in the same way he had tried to break mine. His friends, the ones who had stood by him without question, the ones who had defended him blindly, started to turn on him, started to pull away, started to realize that maybe, just maybe, they had been wrong about him all along. His reputation, the carefully curated image he had spent years building, the illusion of being the perfect husband, the devoted man, the loving partner, shattered. The sympathy he had once relied on? Gone. The people who had rushed to his defense? Silent. The respect he had carried in social circles? Destroyed. And the best part? I didn't have to do a thing. I didn't have to fight, didn't have to argue, didn't have to scream my truth into the void, hoping someone would listen. Because Mark had destroyed himself with his own actions, had set fire to his own carefully built life, had single-handedly ensured that the very people he had fooled would be the ones to turn their backs on him. And all I had to do was walk away and let the truth do the rest. Months passed, and with every day that went by, I felt lighter, freer, and stronger than I had in years, as if the weight of Mark's lies had finally lifted, as if the version of myself that had once believed in him had disappeared completely. The baby growing inside me wasn't just a miracle. It was proof that life had a way of continuing, proof that even after years of deception and heartbreak I could still move forward, proof that my story wasn't defined by the pain Mark had caused. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving, carving out a life for myself that had nothing to do with him, a life where every decision was my own, a life where I didn't have to second-guess whether the man beside me was truly on my side. I found a new apartment, a place that felt mine in a way nothing ever had before, a space untouched by the memories of a marriage that had been built on manipulation and control. I started making plans for the nursery, picking out colors that felt warm, safe, and full of hope, choosing furniture that symbolized new beginnings instead of broken dreams. I surrounded myself with the people who had truly supported me, who had always wanted the best for me, who had never once tried to take away my choices, who had never once made me feel less than I was. And in those quiet moments, when I felt my baby kick for the first time, when I stood in the middle of the nursery with tears in my eyes, when I realized I had built an entire future without Mark in it, I knew without a single doubt that I had made the right decision. Mark reached out a few times, of course, because men like him always do, because men like him don't know how to let go, because men like him only realize what they had after they've destroyed it beyond repair. He sent long, rambling emails about how he missed me, about how he regretted everything, about how he wanted to be a father now, as if the choice had ever been his, as if his sudden change of heart erased the years of damage he had done. But I didn't believe him. I couldn't believe him. Because his regret wasn't about me, wasn't about the life he had stolen, wasn't about the pain he had caused. It was about control, about losing it, about realizing that for the first time in our relationship he had no power over me anymore. And I refused to give him even a fraction of it back. The day my son was born, I held him close to my chest, staring at his tiny fingers, his peaceful face, his perfect little heartbeat against mine, and I knew with absolute certainty that I had made the right choice. Because this child would never grow up believing that love was about control, would never have to question whether he was wanted, would never have to live under the weight of someone else's lies. He would be loved. He would be cherished. He would never know the man who had tried to take all of this away from me. Because in the end, Mark had spent years trying to take away my choices, trying to convince me that my dreams were impossible, trying to control the one thing he had no right to take. But all he had really done was push me toward a future where I was happier without him. A future where I was stronger than ever. A future where he was nothing more than a mistake I would never make again. And that was a future worth fighting for.